and welcome to the 11th session of the British Council Higher Education Dialogue Series. My name is Summer Shah, and I'm the Country Director of the British Council in Azerbaijan and the Regional Higher Education Programme Director for a region we call Wider Europe, consisting of 15 countries including Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Western Balkans, Central Asia and South Caucasus. As part of our At Home with the British Council programme, we started this Higher Education Dialogue series back in May to create a platform for knowledge sharing and identifying common solutions in our response to COVID-19 worldwide in the higher education sector. Week after week, we have brought together experts from all over the world in the higher education sector to share their experience and ideas, tackling some of the common challenges we all face, such as digital delivery, students and staff engagement, online quality assurance, and student mobility, to name a few. Today's session will be the last one of the current series, and what a panel we've got for you today. We're going to talk about the role of science with two esteemed speakers who are scientists themselves. The first British astronaut, Helen Sharman, and the award-winning science communicator, Al-Khalili. Before I introduce them, I want to remind everyone that your participation to this conversation is just as important. So please share with us your thoughts and your questions in the Q&A section, and like those that resonates with you, and we will try our best to address as many as possible in the next 16 minutes. The session will be recorded and we will send you a link afterwards so that you can watch it and share it with anyone who can't join us right now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Helen Sharman, who is a pioneer, a role model and inspirational speaker. Helen became the first British astronaut in 1991 when she launched in a Soyuz spacecraft to carry out experiments on the Mir space station. After her space flight, Helen became a science communicator and corporate speaker, winning prizes for radio and TV programs and for her talks on STEM, teamwork and resilience. Helen, we are honored to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Summer. It's a real delight to, thank you very much. It's a real delight to be part of this session today. Yes, I'm going to take about this next 10 minutes just to talk a bit about my background and really the motivations that I've had in my life that are relevant when we're talking about science and in particular higher education. So I have a few pictures. I think it's always nice to show a few pictures, isn't it? So let me share those with everybody just now. There we go. So this is a picture that for me represents chemistry. I started out my career by doing a degree in chemistry, but I had no idea when I was at school what I really wanted to study. When I was growing up, certainly there was no chance to be an astronaut in the United Kingdom. That was just not on the agenda at all. I didn't particularly have a particular thing that I was really good at school, and I enjoyed most things, to be honest. I very pragmatically thought if I studied science or engineering, it would give me quite a range of opportunities later on in life. And I just plumped for chemistry, being a kind of a middling subject. I could go physical, I could go biological. So it was a very pragmatic choice, really. But I loved it. I loved the study. I loved university life. I loved that sort of that freedom of thought. And I decided I wanted to apply what I'd learned in the big wide world and go out into industry after my degree. And my first job was in the electronics industry, making display screens, actually, big teams of people. But after a few years, the company was actually quite inward looking, if I'm honest. I didn't really appreciate where my products were going to be used, and the teams were all very much as we were within the company. We didn't share much with what was going on outside the company, and I decided it was time for me to move on. So I looked around for another job where I could use my science, but in more integrated teams, really, and I found another job working for Mars Confectionery. Now, of course, what a great name for a company if you're going to go into space. And I had no idea at the time. When I did become an astronaut, the newspapers decided to call me the girl from Mars. But I had no idea. You know, I was loving my job. I was working on ice cream, on chocolate, using my science in really very international teams. It was my first taste of what I would call a real international team. Mars Confectionery has a number of companies all around a number of factories all around the world, and there were no real borders as far as we could see. Of course, we had to operate within the legal framework of the countries that we were working in. But as far as we were concerned as a team, it didn't matter whether we were working with people who were in the Netherlands or in America or in Australia, wherever they were all around the world, they were just part of our international team, and I loved it. Now, completely out of the blue came a new opportunity, one that I had never, ever imagined could happen to somebody like me. And this was a brand new opportunity to launch to the space station Mir. Now, this was something that had never been possible before. And even when I heard of this opportunity, so this was back in 1989, so over 30 years ago now, the UK didn't have a space agency. And in fact, the UK government had a policy of not funding human spaceflight. So really, this was an almost impossible thing to do. But a company was set up to manage this international collaboration, really, an international collaboration between what was in the Soviet Union, the Soviet Space Agency, and this British company. And that's how I eventually got to go into space. My job was doing experiments on board the space station. This is just a few of the biological experiments I took up with me. But it wasn't just me, of course. I'd been doing my training there in the Soviet Union with Austrians, with Japanese people, with Germans and French. And the Soviet Space Agency had got this big international program going. It wasn't just about doing experiments in space. That was the job. But actually, these missions were much more than that. And they were about creating an astronaut, usually the first from that country, like myself, like the Austrian, for instance, like the Japanese. We were the first people from our country to go into space. But also it was about developing international relations with these countries. And the Soviets were using space as a means to do this. Of course, many nationalities have flown into space. This, I hope, is all of them. I might have missed out some of those who flew as part of the Soviet Union, whereas now they're members of a different nation state. But yeah, a huge number of countries. And it's this international collaboration that enables spaceflight because it's such a big deal in terms of the resources that we require. But of course, it's not just space. It's science, it's engineering, it's all of that we need to go into space and do what we do there. And after my space flight, I decided I wanted to really communicate that, particularly in the United Kingdom at the time. And I did, you know, I became really a sort of a speaker. I spoke to general public, I spoke to schools. I loved working in radio and TV. I worked on behalf of organisations like the Association of Space Explorers, as well as just myself, and really just enjoyed communicating science in that way. Now, more recently, before arriving at Imperial College London to manage the chemistry department, I managed a research team at the National Physical Laboratory in the UK, and at Kingston University I managed the technical support for science, engineering and computing. So I've kind of really enjoyed understanding much more about how higher education works, how it all fits together. Now I work for Imperial's outreach team. I'm the UK outreach ambassador, encouraging school students to continue their studies in STEM, so that's science, technology, engineering and maths. I work part-time so that I can do a lot of my other science communication outside of this. And I work particularly with schools in areas of social deprivation. Know that there's lots of reasons why any individual student might want to go to university, and I'm sure in some of these previous sessions you've discussed many of these. But of course, for a lot of people, it is the job at the end of it that makes it such a big deal to go to university. And I thought it might be just quite interesting just to think a little bit about that, because of course that's really what drives higher education. It's not the individual students so much, but it's the value that those students, those graduates bring to the economy, but also to society. This is just a quick diagram really of the last, the 4 years worth of the destinations of Imperial's graduates. And I'm showing you this because it's really a good proxy. Imperial at graduate level teaches only science, engineering, medicine type of subjects. So it's just STEM subjects. So this is a sort of a very rough proxy for where all STEM graduates tend to end up in those big sectors there. And you can see, of course, there's a huge peak there in health and social work, and any university that teaches medicine is going to have that because people tend to go into that particular area. It's a very sort of a very applied area that they're doing. But if you look outside of that, look at the next big peak in numbers is that financial sector, the banking and financial sector. And after that, it's probably IT, I reckon. You'd expect a lot of people to go into technical R&D kind of work. But look at the other thing, manufacturing and other business activities. I think it's really clear how many diverse sectors really value the thinking skills of STEM graduates. There is a plethora of papers and articles about the value of science engineering subjects themselves to society. I think this particular one by Freeman, Marginson and Tytler really kind of sums up what is out there, and I think everybody you can read that yourselves. But for me, that's a big thing. It's about they're fundamental to national development and productivity, and it's not just the economic competitiveness, but it's societal well-being too. But even that statement doesn't quite capture the really big view that STEM subjects, can make a difference. They can really make a difference to humankind. If we go back into space for a minute, the International Space Station, here's a part of the recent crew there. I mean, it's the experiments that people are doing in space which are improving our life on Earth and giving us an ability to look further afield, to the next frontier of human exploration. But I'm not just talking about the astronauts now. We can do experiments on Earth, of course, but it's that International Space Station that keeps the astronauts alive. I mean, it's huge. It's as big as a football pitch, and it's really complex. The engineering, the science that's gone into developing that, and it's been in space now for a long time. Different modules have been added. These huge complex achievements really can be enabled by international collaboration with common goals, and I think that's really important. In space, we choose to be in space because we think it's an important place for many countries to be in. For COVID-19, well, we kind of have to be working like that together, but there are other things that will require the world to come together. There will be other pandemics. We have climate change. There may at some point be an asteroid impact or a potential impact coming towards the Earth that we need to deflect. I think it's, I'll just leave you with this wonderful photograph taken by the Apollo 17 crew. But from space, when we look back at the Earth, it is so completely obvious and immediately clear how interconnected everything is on Earth. There's so much that doesn't care for national borders, that's far too big for any single nation state to be able to manage alone. But I think it's STEM research and education and this international cooperation and debate that means together we can choose how to use science to benefit us all. Now, I don't really think we can or we should be following science. We can't actually, because what's scientific evidence can be used in multiple ways. But what science can do is help us to solve the right problems, if you like, make the right decisions for the right people and ultimately for the whole planet. So I will leave you with that thought and unshare my screen and pass you all back to Summer.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that fascinating presentation, and especially that last picture and message that you delivered with that was just inspiring. I mean, I think it's so true, given the situation we're all in right now because of this pandemic. So, I think the international collaboration working together is so important, much more important than ever before. And I'd like to come back to that and several other things you mentioned during your presentation, such as, you know, the choosing STEM subjects, the power of STEM subjects, and the value of higher education and graduates, and also, you know, the importance of science communication. But I'm going to park them for the moment so we can hear the story of our next speaker, Professor Jim Al-Khalili, who's a physicist, author, and broadcaster, and one of the best-known science communicators in the UK. Jim has written 12 books on popular science, between them translated into over 26 languages, as well as his first novel. He's a regular presenter of TV science documentaries and the long-running Radio 4 program, The Life Scientific. Jim, it's a privilege to have you on our panel today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Summer. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a long-standing and deep affection for the British Council, and I'll explain why that came about in a moment. I don't have any pictures to show, so sort of Helen's trumped me on that, but then I've not been into space either, so you know, I'm not going to compete. Yes, let me say a little bit about myself, about my career, because I think it's probably my generation of scientists who have been able to continue doing what they're doing, particularly for me as an academic research physicist, as well as being public facing and promoting and engaging with wider society about science. I remember when I first started my academic career at university after a PhD and then wanting to get a lectureship, I was warned off doing science communication. I was told that, look, Jim, focus on your research, publishing papers, getting your data, applying for research grants, doing all the things that academic does, teaching undergraduates, and leave the communicating of the science to those who've got spare time, which seemed crazy to me, because the most passionate people about science are the people who are doing it, who've done it, who have a story to tell. And so gradually throughout my career, I managed to balance both remaining as an active academic, as you say, I'm now professor of physics at the University of Surrey, but at the same time enjoying my writing and broadcasting. I've always derived, I guess, as much pleasure explaining complex ideas in physics. So my background is in quantum physics, the theory of atoms and the particles that make up atoms, famously very mathematical, very obscure, very sort of mind-boggling and counterintuitive. But I love trying to get it across to non-experts as best as I can, and I get as much pleasure seeing, as we say, the penny drops, seeing the moment of enlightenment, of realization, as someone understands a concept they haven't before, because of the way I put it across. As much pleasure as I do learning something myself for the first time, which is why I wanted to carry on with both. Now, my background, you know, for many who don't know me, Al-Khalili is an Arabic name. In fact, it's Persian in origin. My great, I think about 4 or 5 grandfathers of my father's side came from Iran and settled in Iraq. So my father from Iraq came to the UK, where he met my English mother when he was studying engineering. They married, went back to Iraq. I was born in Baghdad. And so I grew up in a household very much sort of British sort of surroundings. The BBC World Service was constantly on in the background. English was my first language. But at the same time, I went to school in Iraq, and I'm now bilingual, English and Arabic. And we would come over to the UK to visit my maternal grandparents every few summers. And then finally, when I was 16, we settled in the UK, and I carried on with my education. The reason why I'm telling you this sort of long-winded biography is because growing up in Baghdad, we didn't have access to libraries of English books. We didn't have access to you know, sort of the TV documentaries, the sort of the little science communication there would have been on TV in the UK. Of course, we didn't have. You know, a lot of my contemporaries fell in love with people like Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. I'd never got a chance to watch that, but we did have the British Council. And the British Council in Baghdad had a library, and in that library there were wonderful books, and I would spend as often as I could, would visit there, and I'd borrow as many books as they would allow me to, and I'd churn through them. So it really helped me develop a broader view than just my education provided me with. So for me, science communication is more than simply telling the wider public about the latest discoveries of, you know, the Higgs boson, or a planet orbiting a distant star, or, you know, or what a black hole is like. It's much broader than that. As Helen touched on, communicating the importance of STEM subjects is probably more vital now than ever. You know, we do hear all around the world, governments, particularly in now trying to combat this terrible pandemic, that they are following the scientific evidence, that they are being advised by scientists to put policies in place. By and large, governments, apart from those individuals who may be denying science, who are anti-science in their attitudes, by and large, governments are trying to do their best. But politicians don't often understand how science works. Science is changing, and it's ever changing, particularly something like this coronavirus. We are learning all the time. So one of the most important things for me about communicating science isn't just getting across that knowledge, the fascinating stuff, and putting it in the right language that people can be inspired by. Yes, that's important. We need to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers. It's also explaining how science works. The idea that we are never certain about things. Well, sometimes I'm certain that if I jump off a roof, gravity is going to pull me down. I'm not going to float up into the air. But we should also always harbour doubts about our views and opinions, because a scientific theory could always be replaced by a better one when more data or evidence comes in. Scientists, and this would be so refreshing if politicians could do this as well, scientists don't mind admitting when they're wrong. You know, if I have a theory that makes some prediction about some, let's say in my area in quantum physics, that then some experiment shows is wrong or deficient in some way, I'll say, fine, great, that theory was wrong. Let's try and find a better explanation. We're always looking to learn more, gain more knowledge about the world around us. And we know we get it wrong, and there's no harm or shame in admitting when we get it wrong. Something politicians, I think, find it rather more difficult to do. So for me, science communication is as vital as my own academic research is. As you've mentioned, Summer, I've written books on popular science. I've made TV documentaries. I mean, if I'm honest, I do it not altruistically. I do it because I enjoy it. It gives me pleasure to try and find ways of explaining science, of getting across the idea of science and how important it is. When people come up to me and say, you know, I decided to do a physics degree because I watched your TV documentary, that not only makes me feel proud that, you know, that I've done something, you know, important, I think I always find it surprising, because I feel I'm doing what I'm doing because I enjoy it, and it's sort of almost unexpected when I find that other people found it important and useful as well. So it's great that we have events like this where we can talk openly about why we do what we do and why it's so important to get across the way we do science. And I think I should stop there.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Jim. And well, I mean, you enjoy doing it. We really enjoy listening to you. And so I think even, you know, from the screen, I can feel your passion. And I think that is really important. Whatever we do, you know, that passion can really send out a strong message and inspire and motivate people to join the courses. And of course, there's so many things you said, you know, in your sort of opening remarks that really resonate with me. You know, critical thinking, taking an evidence-based approach, learning from our mistakes, and of course, the power of science communication. But what struck me the most was the important role the British Council has played in your growing up and in your career in becoming who you are today. So I mean, that's beautiful. I mean, we continue to hear these wonderful stories globally about the role we as a cultural relations organization and the way we have created an access to science, to the outside world for many people in different countries and territories. And it's just amazing to hear how our library has given you that chance to learn more and then help you to play a small part in you becoming who you are today. Excellent. Now I want to sort of unpick a bit more about the role of science. So in fact, that's the main question we asked in this session today. We also asked our audience this question in a pre-event row. So before I come to the panel, I want to share with you what our audience have told us when we asked them, has the role of science been strengthened by this pandemic? So let me just share with everyone the screen, and then you'll be able to see that actually the majority of our audience have said yes, the role of science has been strengthened, with a small percentage saying, okay, it's a bit early to say, and very few say that no, it hasn't been strengthened. So which I think, echoes what you both have been saying. And the other thing that, of course, I think you touched upon as well, increasingly, we're seeing more scientists across different media than we have done ever before, on TV, on social media. We often see now politicians coming out accompanied by scientists. Take Professor Chris Whitty, for example, who is the Chief Medical Officer for England, who often accompanies the Prime Minister in the UK in the daily briefings. He now has 250,000 followers, but before the pandemic, he wasn't nearly as well known. So would you agree with our audience that the role of science has been strengthened in this since the start of this pandemic? And do you think the pandemic has supported greater visibility for scientists who in the past might have been kept behind the scenes? Helen, may I come to you first?
Yeah, I think, yes, it's clear, isn't it, that we've seen scientists on TV and they've been, like you say, standing next to our political leaders. And I think that's been certainly that we've seen how science and the views of scientists have been integral in that decision making, really as wide, if you like, as global governance. Really, it's gone quite big. I think there's been pros and cons of it. I think we've seen some types of scientists. Of course, we've seen a lot of the biologists, a lot of the medics. You mentioned Chris Whitty as the Chief Medical Officer. We haven't seen, of course, a lot of the, let's say, the physical scientists so much. So yes, we've perhaps got a more of a sort of a single-sided view of what's out there. But that's not to say it's not that physicists aren't involved in the pandemic. In fact, we know engineers have been helping to create ventilators, for instance. So I think there's we've seen some science and some scientists more than others. But we've certainly, I think, got this feeling that science really is, like I said, it's sort of integral to that big, the big push towards trying to solve the problem. I think the downside is there's been so much science that's come at us so quickly. The science, as sort of Jim was mentioning about the science being sort of uncertain and new information coming up. So I think sometimes it's been seen that scientists disagree with each other. Therefore, they don't know what they're talking about sometimes. And I think the scientists themselves would agree with with what Jim said. It's well, I now know better than I did before, or well, from my perspective, I can tell you from a virologist's perspective, but from this person's perspective, from the modelers or from the epidemiologists, it might be slightly different, let's say, advice that they would be giving. And so that's a kind of I suppose the downside, and the huge volume of information, trying to pick our way through it. And sometimes we've got information out very quickly. It hasn't gone through the normal scientific controls. It's not been peer reviewed. So there's been some science that has been withdrawn, certainly, and there's probably other stuff out there that should be withdrawn, and we have to yet pick through that. I don't know what you think, Jim. I'm sure you can add to that.
No, I agree. I think we're clearly seeing some people regard science as absolute, that science is about fact, and therefore if you tell me something this week and next week you change your mind, tell me something different, well, those are two facts that are contradictory. Therefore, I can't trust anything you say. So scientists don't know what they're talking about. So I think that's right. That is a danger. Which is why we do have to get across how science develops, how you come up with a hypothesis, you gather data. As you get more observational data, you learn more. That means you adjust and you improve your understanding. And it's certainly a good thing that science is more visible. Certainly here in the UK, government ministers and different departments have always had for many years now, their science advisors helping them develop policies. Of course, politicians develop policies that depend on more than just scientific evidence. They've got to take into lots of other things into account, economic, public acceptability and so on, their own ideological views. But now with the pandemic, we're seeing that scientific advice is brought to the fore. The danger is that, if politicians get the policy wrong, there's that worry that they turn around and say, well, it was the science that's to blame. It's the science that gave us the wrong evidence. And I think the wider society understanding how science works, that we do learn from our mistakes, is absolutely vital, because this virus and all aspects of it, you mentioned, Helen, certain on the life science, the biological sciences and medical sciences, we've seen much more visibility. But even there, you've got virologists, you've got epidemiologists, you've got people who are trying to develop vaccines, you've got the social scientists trying to understand human behavior when you put societies under lockdown, and what other issues that leads to. So it's very broad and it's complicated, and that's why there are different views and there are different scientists, some highlighting the importance of face masks, others are highlighting other aspects. Some are talking about whether or not what fraction of society has developed immunity, how long immunity lasts for. We don't know. And the thing is, there's no shame in not knowing. We are trying to understand. For me, there is the worry that, particularly with social media, there are conspiracy theories that abound. There are, people who deny the science, and there are lots of different views. And the average person who follows Twitter or Facebook or even news networks finds it very difficult to disentangle what is valid, what is careful, evidence-based, peer-reviewed science, and what is just some guy's opinion, in the name of science. So it's very hard. It's very hard for society to know what to believe and what to trust at a time when trusting in scientific evidence is probably of greater importance than it's ever been before.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, for that input. And I guess that actually moves us quite nicely onto the role of science communication when there is such a high volume of science out there, and then different views from different scientists. Then, you could argue that it's even more important for scientists to be able to communicate effectively with the general public. I mean, we at the British Council certainly see that. So, Jim, you will know that we have been running the world's leading science communication competition, FameLab, for a number of years now in many countries around the globe, where the participants, usually young scientists and researchers, would be given 3 minutes to inspire and educate a live audience of the research they are doing in science, engineering, maths, and other subjects. So what impact, in your personal experience as a successful science communicator, do you think hearing from scientists has had on the general public?
I think communicating science in the last 20 years, certainly in the UK, I mean, I've always argued that the UK is actually leading the world in public engagement in science, because, well, we have broadcasters like the BBC that will make science documentaries. We have science festivals in almost every town and city in the country. We have popularizers of science in universities. Not just me, there are many other scientists who have been given the space and the credibility to go out and talk to the wider public. And that's something that's happened in the last 10, 20 years at an accelerating rate. So things are much brighter now in terms of communicating science than they've ever been before. But of course, as you've mentioned, Summer, on the other side, there's a lot of noise. There are a lot of voices. You know, I mean, it's very easy, and we can laugh and debunk silly notions like, you know, the Earth is flat or the moon landings never happened. It's more serious when we want to find the best way to communicate the importance of vaccine, for example. You know, there's a movement of people who are very untrusting of vaccinations, you know, or people who are who think the whole coronavirus is a conspiracy. It's a weapon. The Chinese, there are people in China who think it was developed by the US. There are people in the US who think it was developed by China. There are people who think it's created by 5G network masts. So, you know, your average person isn't silly. They're not curious or able to think critically and rationally. It's just that when they're bombarded with all of this, we need to find a way for science communicators to get through and say, look, you can trust this source, you can believe this because of such and such. That is untrustworthy. It's not based on evidence. It's based on the opinion of someone who has an other ideological or political motive for promoting an idea. But it's a tough job, but that doesn't mean we should shy away from it.
I completely agree with you, Jim. Helen, would you like to add to that? I mean, from your experience as a science communicator, especially after you come back from space.
Oh, I was given a great platform on which to talk directly to audiences, and that I think is wonderful. If you can actually physically be in a room, or even now virtually, we are directly talking with people, and that's wonderful. I think often scientists talking through the media, let's say, sometimes it's wonderful. I mean, Jim, your programs where you are the media, that's wonderful. But quite often we are edited, and then what we say is taken, or can be sometimes taken out of context and misunderstood. Sometimes key words are omitted. So, for instance, there's been a lot of confusion recently about the data that we've been given about COVID deaths, for instance. Are we reporting deaths per capita? All right, so like the population of the country. Is it deaths per 100,000 of those who have already been tested positive? And if you don't actually know the parameters with which you've either done your experiment or the data that you're talking about specifically, it can get very, very confusing. And I think to make things seem more flowing in the media, to cut down on a few boring seconds at the beginning, I can see the incentive for people working on TV to cut those out, and we'll just get to the nitty-gritty. But that can be very confusing. So yes, where possible, where we can go and actually have that direct contact with a scientist, but still, who's to know that that scientist is actually reporting good science, let's say, that it's been well reviewed or that it's been well critiqued by other scientists before they report it to us. So I think it is difficult. We've just got to have really good public understanding of science. If we can get a good sort of scientifically literate public from the get-go, then people hopefully will question. They will think that doesn't make sense. I'm going to really ask about that, or I'm just going to lodge that fact and not really take it on board yet until I've found out something else. So I'd like to see, I think we've got to tackle this whole thing in the round, as they say.
Thank you, Helen. And then just to follow up on that, I want to ask a question that came from the live audience. And do you think that the world of alternative facts, truth, has damaged the credibility of science, and what can we all do to counter that? I don't know if either of you would like to.
I think you mentioned that already a bit, didn't he? It's either it's pseudoscience. We see it in even before COVID. We see it in marketing, in advertising. Whether you can believe what you're being told, you're fed in order to try and buy a product. Is it going to make your hair shinier or not, or is it actually going to do you harm? And yes, sometimes this thing, it can really be harmful. I'm often having to answer questions about, you know, the flat Earth, as Jim's already mentioned, and other conspiracy theories. And You know, I think it's partly because sometimes we're just scared to know the real answer. And so it's easier just to make up a nice story about something that makes us feel a bit more comfortable, and then we can hide our head and forget about it and get on with the rest of our lives. But it's that's why we need good science communication, I think, like I said before, just from the very beginning.
It is sometimes I don't despair, but I could certainly see the difficulty that, you know, a lot of psychologists and social scientists talk about something called cognitive dissonance, which is the idea that if you hold a particular view, you know, on something, then hearing evidence to the contrary, you dismiss it. It makes you actually feel mentally uncomfortable. So you downplay any evidence that conflicts with your existing views or opinions. But the flimsiest of evidence that might support what you think, you build it up to confirm even more what you already know. So sometimes you think it's quite hard to change people's minds. If a conspiracy theorist, if I talk to a conspiracy theorist, I say, what would it take for me to persuade you that you're wrong? And invariably they'll say nothing. They are so, you know, it doesn't, and that's why a conspiracy theory is so different from a scientific theory, because in science, any evidence that I think is valid and accurate and reliable that conflicts with my view would force me to change my view. You know, that's the way science develops. So it is hard when we live in a world, as you say, of alternative facts or fake news. You know, for a person who believes a particular thing, anything opposing their view is fake news. It's not fake news because it's not based on evidence. It's fake news because they don't like to hear it, because it goes against what they feel. And I think we've always had these ideological sort of polarized views and opinions in society, whether it's cultural or religious or whatever. We're seeing it highlighted now because maybe of social media. You know, the people at the extremes of particular views tend to shout the loudest, and the silent majority in the middle seem to think that everything's polarized. But I don't think social media has particularly exacerbated things. I think we've always had that, but it doesn't mean that those of us who are trying to get across the idea that you should think critically and rationally and be evidence-based, we shouldn't give up hope that we can get that message across if we try hard enough.
Thank you, both of you. I certainly hope that our session today will get that message across, and hopefully, you know, get a few people changing their minds about what they should or should not believe. I want to move us on to talk about international collaboration, which you both touched upon during your initial remarks. And you know, part of our role at the British Council is to connect the UK with other countries through scientific international research collaborations, discussions and engagement. And I guess what we're observing is that perhaps one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that it actually brought the communities closer together. So we're seeing that universities are collaborating, you know, across the UK and internationally as well. So are you observing that as well in terms of science? And what more can we do to ensure there's greater knowledge sharing and international collaboration when there is limitation on travel?
Yeah, yeah, in terms of the international side of it, I think we have to encourage knowledge sharing, because it's a sort of, states have a tendency to towards isolation because of the competition, you know, for commercial gains. So I think it's natural for states not to want to share, and universities will have all of this, you know, their intellectual property, and whenever you get involved in an international program, you will sort of sign up on IP rights, and everybody, you know, the amount of time that we spend looking at IP is huge compared to the amount of time that we spend looking at what sort of science we're going to do, for instance. So it's really important. But yes, I think when it comes to some of the big things in the world, I think there's room for some new body that's global, perhaps along the lines of the Europeans' joint research Commission, something like that, but more nothing, not that does science itself, but where we can perhaps have a repository of information. I'm thinking perhaps it has to be funded so that it will give out, it can fund multinational research projects, public and private. So we're bringing everybody together. I think it will be bureaucratic, but I think it would probably be worth the downside for the benefits that that we would get from that. And then we could post in this body our information very, very rapidly on perhaps, I'm thinking about key themes, and I mentioned about an asteroid impact possibly, and there'll be many other things, but let's say there's an asteroid that we've seen and it's going to hit the Earth if we don't do anything about it in 10 years' time. Right, so the world could come together and work out how together we are going to deflect that asteroid, but we have to do it together, and we have to be able to do it quite quickly. So we have to know what information is has been peer reviewed and is let's say good, what information has just been put up there very, very quickly so others can use it, which is great, but it might not be, let's say, good science yet. We all need to have be able to share. We need to have this kind of standardization of terminology, because I think what I've certainly as a layperson been very frustrated at trying to compare different countries' data on COVID-19, for instance, because people measure death rates in different ways. Even just the terminology that we use is different, and I think that's something, some sort of standardization first, just some key agreed themes, let's say, that the world, we can foresee the world is going to have to address in the future. And there are many other things, but that would be my, if I could do one thing, if I could set up one big new thing, that would be it, I think.
I like that. If you could do one thing, Jim, what would you do?
I would try and get support for Helen's idea of getting a World Science Association set up, and I would sort of advocate very strongly for that to happen. I think that's a wonderful idea, because I think a lot of people don't appreciate that, you know, you have these different separate nations with political borders, and they have their own economic and political and you know, business interests and commercial interests that are sort of quite separate, and they don't appreciate that under the surface, we scientists have always, for us, well, certainly during our lifetimes, have always been international. We go to international conferences. You know, I look around my physics department at the University of Surrey, and there are people from so many different nations, and it just doesn't occur to us to do anything any differently. And certainly when you get something like the coronavirus pandemic, which requires global sort of participation, then suddenly people are seeing, oh, scientists are collaborating, they're working together. And, you know, we shouldn't forget, we have climate change to deal with, we have dwindling resources to deal with, we have so many global challenges that we have to tackle in the 21st century, and countries aren't going to be able to do it alone. Even if politicians decide to you know, get into trade wars with each other or ideological arguments, scientists are always going to work together. I think we've got to get that message across.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Helen.
So the I first really came into to understanding like this real international collaboration, I suppose, when I met the Association of Space Explorers. So back in the Cold War times, this was a club, really, a sort of association of astronauts who have just established themselves for themselves to communicate, to keep in contact, because it was Cold War and officially they weren't allowed to, but they saw a need. And I think this informality, and you know, Jim, you mentioned about how you look around your department, there are people from all over the world, but we tend to come at this through our work and gradually as we're sort of introduced to different conferences and so on. And I think we have to somehow trust each other. We can't just suddenly sort of create this new global forum that I'm suggesting and immediately trust each other if we don't appreciate each other's background, if we don't know each other. And so this informality of meeting, of really being friends with each other as well is really important. And scientists say sometimes it just happens organically, but we could create this too with young fora for young scientists, for instance, where young people just come together and then they feel much more able to challenge each other. I think there's quite a hierarchical thing sometimes going on, and esteemed scientists like Jim, you might not be challenged so much by the young people as they might challenge themselves. So just to get that idea that challenge is good, but there's lots of ways of creating this trust. It's really kind of a teamworky thing, really, but we have to try and help create it sometimes.
Definitely, and then that's one of the purposes of us setting up, this dialogue series, to create a togetherness so that we can support each other, challenge each other, and come up with common solutions. That's great. Thank you both. I want to touch upon women in science and STEM subjects. I think you both talk about how important that was. And before I do that, we actually have a couple of live poll questions I want to ask the audience to participate so that we can get their views on what they think is needed to get more women into science, and also do they think if STEM subjects will become more popular as a result of this pandemic. So I post that link of the live poll, so everyone who's watching, if you can click on that and let us know your view, that would be great. I want to come to you first on this subject, Helen. We know that when you went to school, you were the only girl in your physics and chemistry classes. Now, things have improved a bit since then, but still the latest UNESCO report shows that still only 35% of STEM students in higher education globally are women. What can we do to encourage more women in science?
Well, a long time ago, a couple of decades ago, I chaired a panel of educators and industrialists thinking about this very topic, and we came actually to the conclusion that we have to tackle society and very young people and sort of education, the schools and universities, all in one go simultaneously. If you talk to the children at school, science is wonderful and all the girls can, science is great and no problem. The girls go home and they say to their parents, hey, I've had this great science talk, and they're told by their parents, oh, but don't be ridiculous, it's not going to happen for you, is it? For instance, I'm not saying that happens every time, but that's quite common. So it's not reinforced at home, and then they go out and they read books and they see films, and it's not reinforced by society either. So it has to happen, I think, multi-ways simultaneously. So we can look at it from the higher education perspective and make sure that women are given the right roles, they're paid for equal skills, equal jobs, they get the equal pay, for instance. We can look critically at ourselves as an organisation to make sure that we're promoting women properly, that they've got representation on governing bodies and so on. But if we don't also at the same time target the young children in schools and the general public, then we won't have enough of that feed coming through in the first place. So yeah, I think there's lots of particular ways, but I think I'm sure Jim's got some good ideas as well. I'd like to sort of get his views on this, but we could talk for hours on this subject.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, two points to make, I guess. I absolutely agree with you, Helen, that the fact that not enough girls at school are going to subjects like physics or chemistry, but physics in particular, is because it's perceived as a boy subject. A lot of the women physicists that I know who've made it to the very top, senior professors, fellows of the Royal Society, when you ask them about their science education at school, very often they say, I went to an all-girls school. So physics wasn't seen as a boy subject. There weren't boy subjects and girl subjects, and therefore they were free to do the subjects that they felt passionate about, rather than having it knocked out of them, as you say, Helen, because it's not seen as an appropriate subject for girls. So that has to change. That subjects should not be seen as applying to whether you're male or female. The other thing is role models. Helen, you're an example. I mean, there's no denying, the first British astronaut is a woman. It's something we probably don't shout about quite enough, in my view. Certainly, young girls, when they look to see, what you don't want to see is that all scientists are stereotypically white, middle-aged men, very often bald. Although, I've got a tan, so I'm sort of, not quite as white as some. So diversity is very important in STEM. I don't just mean diversity, more women, although of course that's the most important thing, since women make up half the population. But diversity in terms of cultural backgrounds, diversity in terms of racial sort of broad distributions. In countries like the UK, we don't have the same distribution in terms of gender, race, culture, religion, other identities in science as we do in wider society. And you're going to have to ask the question why, because that benefits science. Being able to tackle problems, coming at it with a different worldview, a different perspective, can actually help solve problems in science. It's not just about, well, it's fact, it's knowledge, and it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, man or woman, you're going to solve that equation or do that experiment. No, a lot of science is about how you think about the world, and getting different ways of thinking about it is absolutely vital. And if we're cutting off half the population because certain areas of science are not deemed as suitable for girls to study, it's just crackers.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a fantastic YouTube clip. I'll share it with you, Summer, so if you want to post it to everybody. But it's about a classroom of children, and they draw pictures of a firefighter and a doctor and a some other person who you would not expect to be, I think, a fighter pilot. And of course, most of them are men. And then the class is asked, would you like to see these people in real life? And they walk in dressed in their garbs. And of course, they're women. And the children's faces just drop. They just can't believe it. They must be dressing up. It can't be real. So it's a great sort of depiction on role models. But I think also girls, we can generalize. We perhaps shouldn't always, because of course we know there are exceptions. I often think about myself as thinking perhaps more of a male type brain than a female type brain, but generally girls like to think more about the reasons why we're doing the science, rather than it's just fun because it's science. Well, why are we doing it? What is the purpose of the science? Girls appreciate active language rather than passive language much more. So with science is often taught, rather than I put I put my finger on the paper, the finger was put on the paper is how we were taught. So we create a kind of language that is quite off-putting, and it's not the way girls often appreciate. So I think if we're cognizant of that fact as well, and just emphasising the collaborative nature of science brings girls in. There's lots of different ways that we can look at this. We don't separating girls and boys is a good thing. And I agree, Jim. We really ought to consider separating girls and boys for science. It goes against the grain sometimes when I think about just bringing everybody together. But yes, it's something to consider. But equally, when we're teaching, when we're talking, if we're bearing in mind it's that collaborative, it's the discussive nature, that it's not always right and wrong. But we need, as we've been talking about COVID, to pick out the bits of science that we think are going to be important at that particular time, and weigh them up, balance one against the other, and then make a decision. All those things are very attractive to girls.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Helen and Jim. And I think I will just quickly show you the results from the live poll. I think our audience are agreeing with you. So what is needed to get more women into science? Role models, and expose young girls to STEM, and also, combat stereotypes, which, goes back to the point Jim made about diversity and inclusion, which is so important. And on a positive note, the audience also told us, the majority of them, that STEM subjects will become more popular as a result of this pandemic. So hopefully we'll see more young girls and boys choosing STEM subjects and becoming scientists like yourself and science communicators in the future. Now, talking as a role model, I think we have to talk about space. Helen, what does it mean for you to be the first British person in space, and what did you learn from that unique experience?
Ooh. Well, I think it was certainly a great honour to feel as though I was representing my country, even though it wasn't part of a government framework. I still felt very much as though I needed to do a good job, because it wasn't just my space flight. It belonged to the British people as well. And then when I came back from space, I felt as though because it wasn't just mine, I ought to share it. And so talking about not just my space flight, but then this idea of science communication was really all about sharing that in the best way, in the framework that I had at the time, that I knew would be supported. So yes, it's, for me, it's all sort of tied up with it being somehow not just something that I did for fun, although I did do it for fun. It's something that it really put Britain on the map of human spaceflight, and I'm very proud to have been able to do that.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I certainly still have hope that I will be able to, share that experience in the future, Helen. But I guess some of us feel space and astronaut may be quite far away from us. But in fact, space is fundamental to the way of life for all people on Earth. And there is an increasing risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation in space. The UK thinks the time is right to take a holistic view and is leading work to reduce space threats through responsible behaviours. Jim, would you elaborate on why space is so relevant for everybody and what are the socio-economic benefits of space?
Yeah, I think there is that idea that space is out there to explore in the same way that, why do we climb Mount Everest? Because it's there, because of humanity's sort of thirst for adventure. It's, governments don't plow billions of pounds, dollars, whatever, into space technology just because astronauts want to go and explore and have an adventure. They wouldn't waste that sort of money if it wasn't absolutely crucial to the well-being of our economies and our societies in the future. Just one example is telecommunications. We all use mobile phones that all use GPS technology to locate where you are in the world. GPS is more than just finding where you are. GPS helps us map the Earth, to study Earth's weather systems. It helps in emergencies, if there are natural disasters, for relief efforts. It helps with agriculture. It helps all sorts of areas. But just the GPS itself is absolutely vital, and it depends on satellite technology. Satellites put in orbit, and whenever you want to find out where you are, your phone is receiving signals from several satellites out in space, and it's using those positions of their satellites to triangulate its position. And the science and engineering and technology that's gone into those is absolutely remarkable. And without space technologies being developed, we wouldn't have that. So it's not just about going and looking for life on Mars. It's about so much more than that. We as a human race, we are expanding, developing our technologies. Sooner or later, we're going to want to explore the stars, and that's inevitable. But along the way, there are these huge societal benefits because of the technologies that are spin-offs from our space research.
Thank you, Jim. Helen, would you like to add anything to that?
Oh, I'm sure we couldn't possibly make the, a full list would go on forever. But yes, Jim mentioned all the Earth observation stuff, which of course is helping us get better crop yields and look at pollution and monitor shipping and all of that. It's great. Broadband, broadband in remote areas is really helping people remain connected with the rest of the world. And of course, the spin-offs Jim mentioned, but also there's the direct things. So spin-offs, scientists can sometimes argue you can get spin-offs from whatever you invest in, which is true to a point. But the direct things that come from space are things like the batteries, the fuel technology, and solar cells. So a lot of the green stuff, and then the future. We're thinking about a satellite could gather energy, if not through solar panels, possibly on the moon, solar panels on a satellite, or possibly huge mirrors, could then focus energy, which we could then direct, possibly energy transfer, perhaps through microwaves, something like that, maybe lasers back to Earth. So that's really looking at green technology for the future. So I think there's a whole scenario there about use of space technology as well. And that's apart from all the microgravity experiments that astronauts do that improve health and our general understanding of life on Earth.
Thank you, Helen. And I agree with, I think we could go on and then for hours and hours on this topic. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I do want to ask one last question as we bring the session to a close, a question that was submitted by a participant before the session started. What do you wish you knew as a young person? The advice you would give your younger self may be just what someone needs to hear right now. So can I ask each of you to give that piece of advice to your younger self and the rest of our audience? Helen?
Shall I go? So I think it's definitely for me, I was a very shy, retiring youngster, teenager, I wouldn't have wanted to do anything like this. I would have done anything, in fact, to avoid talking, putting myself on show. And if I could just take myself back, I would say, don't worry about getting something wrong. Just go out there, give things a go. If people laugh at you, well, so what? You've done the right thing for the right reason in your view. You know, get on with it and have a bit more confidence. So that fear of failure, we just need to, I think, get rid of that. It's all very well to question yourself, but just have that confidence to do what you think is right in life.
Mine's very similar, actually. I think, you know, when I was 10, 11, 12, 13 and just starting to get interested in science, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Who does at that age? My advice would be, you know, follow your passion. Choose those subjects at school that, not necessarily the ones that you find easy, but the ones that you find that get you excited, you know, get you enthused. That's what you should follow. Don't follow subjects because that's going to lead to a career that, you know, your parents probably would wish for you. You know, resist that. Do follow your passion. If your passion is in science, whether it's in physical sciences, whether it's in medical sciences, whether it's in space exploration, whether it's in geology, I mean, science is so broad. If that is your passion, then pursue it, because chances are that's what you'll excel at.
Thank you, Jim and Helen, for those inspiring messages. I do hope they will inspire not only the audience, but through the audience, many young people worldwide who are considering STEM or any other subjects by following their passion and then achieve great success in their life. On that positive note, I'm afraid I'll have to bring this session to a close. Helen, Jim, thank you so much for such a rich, stimulating and inspiring conversation. I've enjoyed it tremendously and learned a huge amount myself. And to everyone who's watching, as we take a summer break of the current dialogue series, I also want to take the opportunity to thank all previous speakers, the audience and my colleagues at the British Council for making these sessions possible. We will be in touch to share with you our future plans to continue these important discussions and what we will do at the British Council to help address some of these challenges we all face. Stay safe and see you again soon. Bye bye.